Just for a change, this review is not for a book that I've just finished. This is for a book that I read in 2020, and I read it as part of a year-long mission to read more of the classics, literature, etc. That was part of an initiative that I started with Goodreads a few years before that. When I joined Goodreads, I started adding all my books onto various shelves, as you do. And that was when I realized that a few genres that I really loved, there were only half a dozen books on those shelves. So each year I did a personal challenge to read as many as possible within a genre. I think the most spectacularly successful was the classic science fiction. I read and reread a lot of them. I think over 100. Another year was marine biology was my focus, and of course as non-fiction I just don't read that as fast as I read fiction. But in 2020 it was literature. It was a very swings and roundabouts kind of year of reading. I found a lot of classic works of literature that I really loved and really enjoyed. I reread a few, like my Austens. I was generous about the notion of what classic literature was. I included Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. One of the nicest surprises was Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. I read Robinson Crusoe, which was very, I'm going to tell you, hit or miss. If ever a book has aged badly, it was that one. Anyway, I'm not reviewing that book. Moll Flanders. Being by Defoe, I expected it to be similar to Robinson Crusoe in that I expected it to be very English, middle class, male is the centre of the universe, centric, which is Robinson Crusoe to a T. Moll Flanders was very, very different. And it was only after I'd read the book and was reading about the book that I realised that there's some doubt as to whether Defoe actually wrote it. So Moll Flanders was originally published, I believe, in 1722. Some sources say 1720, some say 1722, whatever. And it purports to be the true account of the life of Moll, detailing her exploits. Now, Defoe was already a recognised author from Robinson Crusoe, and while he was a heavily political writer and speaker, by the time in the 1720s he was becoming less and less so. Interesting point, as a very political writer, if he had been active just a few decades later, he might have found himself an Australian, ended up on a convict ship out here, because a lot of unpopular politicians or political writers did end up doing that. So, while it is usually assumed that this novel was written by Defoe, his name is given to it. It was originally printed anonymously as an apparent autobiography of a woman. The claim that Moll Flanders belonged to Defoe was made by a bookseller called Francis Noble in 1770 after Defoe's death in 1731. So part of the reason why the assumption continues that it's Defoe's is because Moll Flanders is actually based on the life of Moll King, who was very well known at the time, resident of Newgate Prison, I believe. She was a criminal, but a very well known one. And Defoe met her numerous times while she was a resident of Newgate Prison, and that's why it's assumed to be based on her experiences. By the way, the cover design of my book, which I think is a very beautiful one, is a detail from Nell Gwynn, which was painted by Sir Peter Lely in 1680. So it isn't actually Moll Flanders or Moll King. Now, I've got totally sidetracked from what I wanted to say. Okay, so Defoe was pretty prolific in terms of politics. And I read Moll Flanders because it's a classic work of literature and I never had. It's one of those ones that everyone knows about, but so few people that you actually talk to have actually read it. people are willing to tell you all about Daniel Defoe, but if you ask what his favourite work is by, you find out they haven't actually read any of them. They've just read about him, which is valid, but not who I want to be, really. I expected Moll Flanders to be incredibly moralistic and preachy, and I was wrong. It is beautifully written. It doesn't have any of the very rigid writing structure that Robinson Crusoe has. It has dated remarkably well. Of course, you're reading something that was written in the 1700s, and so the attitudes are different, the cadence of the language is different, the words they use are different, but once you get past those differences, the overall feel of the novel is very light-hearted. It's just plain fun. I don't think a lot of people think about literature as being fun, but most of us who read it will have one or two authors for whom it is an actual pleasure to read their work. And in no other sense is Defoe that person, for me, except Moll Flanders, that I've encountered so far. So there is an element of, if not salaciousness to the book, it certainly isn't salacious by modern standards, like young adult books have more smut in them than this, but it was certainly politically questionable, and it was in fact occasion to police censorship a number of times. I don't know what years. Going by Goodreads. Goodreads says it was, so I believe it. So Defoe regularly calls Moll a whore, or has her call herself a whore, because the Moll in this book is very, very upfront about her actions, many of which are not particularly moral, not particularly socially acceptable, perhaps not particularly right if you believe in an inherent right and wrong. But though that judgment is put upon the character and her actions throughout this book, in actual fact, you find that far from being what we would consider a whore, she's practically a nun. The text tells you that she had sex with a grand total of 8 men over her whole life and was married to most of them. Stop for a while and think. In this era of Tinders and Grinders and people who have a strong party lifestyle, 8 men, whole life. And she lived into her 50s at least, I think, in this book. She was married and having kids in her 40s. So I'd say that most party girls probably go through more than 8 men in a year. So, whore, meh. So the moralistic element to this book is slippery. It's mostly from Moll's point of view. There's a few things that are definitely more Christian-based and much more rigid-based, perhaps more middle to upper class perspective. And I would suspect that if Defoe was the writer of this, then those are Defoe's bits, because they're far more similar to other works of his. The majority of it, however, seems to be Moll's world from Moll's point of view. And it's interesting, because in the 1700s, women are rarely thought of as being heavily independent, self-reliant. The way literature portrays them is as limp, I'm going to say it, as Edwardian and Victorian women, high-class women, were meant to be. But this woman is very active. She takes her life into her own hands multiple times. She makes and breaks her fortune a number of times. She does descend to thievery at one stage, but it's a remarkably clear-sighted view of her actions and how she lives her life. So the scruples that Moll talks about are slippery. There's... you can't spoil all this, can you? So in the end, Defoe has her repent and be saved and become an honest woman, and she's transported to the Americas. Here's the point, though. Moll Flanders was transported to the Americas several times. And as an Australian who regularly has to deal with Americans going, ha ha ha, you were settled by convicts, it is astonishing to me how few Americans seem to realise that America was settled by convicts quite extensively, and in, was it 4 or 5 states, long before we were. So, Americans who don't realise that, read this book. you'll find it eye-opening. So Moll goes through a lot of turmoil in her life, which is remarkably untraumatizing to her, apparently. She is born in Newgate Prison to a woman who is a convict. She manages to escape hanging by pleading the belly, which I'm sure anyone who reads history knows is if a woman was pregnant, they wouldn't hang her, they'd wait till she'd popped it out before hanging her. I can't even, but never mind. So Moll Flanders is born in the Newgate Prison, and having done that, her mother manages to get deported to the Americas, the colonies. And Moll is raised by a decent woman. She goes into service. There's 2 sons in the house where she goes into service. The older seduces her but convinces her to marry the younger son, which she does. At some point, she buggers off from that, leaving the children that she's already birthed behind, and gets attached to another man. Basically speaking, a lot of Moll's aim in life is to attach herself to various men who will support her. And I don't know if that's actually how women of her station went about it in the 1700s, or if that's Defoe's interpretation of how they went about it. But many of these relationships that she has are quite ephemeral. So the first time she finds a gentleman to take care of her husband, he goes bankrupt and flees to Europe, leaving her on her own. They had a child, which presumably died. The second time she makes a match that takes her to Virginia colony with a nice man who then introduces her to his mother. She has 3 children with this husband, and then learns that her husband's mother is actually her mother, and so she's just married her brother. Takes off and goes back to England. Bit of a shock, but yeah. So she leaves 2 children behind her there and goes to Bath to get a new husband. She has a lot of con skills. She's conniving and lies about who she is in order to make the sort of connections she wants. She develops a relationship with a man in Bath who has a wife who's in a sanatorium. So that relationship goes from platonic to non-platonic, and there's a few more children. Can't remember what happens to them. By now, Moll is in her 40s. She's had an interesting life. She gets another beau, another man, and some sort of financial heavy-cavey occurs. I can't quite remember it. It's quite detailed, but I don't remember it too well. 2020, that's ages ago. It's amazing I remember the book as well as I do, but I do. And Moll parts from him at some stage, has another baby along the way in some country town, but leaves it behind with someone else. This is a thing she does. She marries a banker, decides that she's a horrible person, but stays married with him for 5 years. Then he goes bankrupt and dies of despair, and there's a few more children. Honestly, this woman, the child count that she's got. Now, at this point, Moll's older. She doesn't have as many chances of attaching gentlemen, and this is when she descends into serious thievery, living in the stews, I believe they're called, and her goal is to become a successful thief, employing wits, charm, femininity, but it's also quite a wicked lifestyle, as both Moll and Defoe make sure to let us know. This is where she becomes known as Moll Flanders. That's her trade name, as it were. Now, at this point, she is caught while engaging in some massive thievery that I don't quite remember, and she ends up in Newgate Prison. From Newgate Prison, in Newgate Prison, she's reunited with one of her husbands. I think that's the same one that went off the colonies. He's a monumental bad guy. Robber, burglary, all sorts of bad stuff he does. But they're soulmates, apparently. regrettable notion of the soulmate is apparently around already in the 1700s. So Moll is found guilty of one charge but not the other. And the result is that she gets sent off to the colonies, and she gets sent off with this bad guy husband of hers. They travel in luxury. She manages in some way to convince the captain of the ship to let them have a cabin instead of traveling with other prisoners. And she also manages to bring a lot of goods on board to start them off in the colonies. And I think there was some sort of financial dealing so that the captain comes off well of it as well. But basically, when they descend the ship, instead of descending the ship as prisoners, they manage to descend as a free man and wife. Virginia, I think it might have been the colony of Virginia. There's a few other colonies, including California. California was a criminal convict colony, apparently. I don't know why I find that entertaining, but I do. So here she is back again in Virginia, or was it Maryland? I don't know. She's in the convict colonies, but she's a free woman. She introduces herself to her brother and their son in disguise. Sure. Maybe she dyed her hair or something. Her mother had left her something, which she gets her hands on somehow. And at this point, I think, is where Defoe stops it and allows her to become a non-fallen woman, having repented of a life of crime, but she's now a successful, wealthy woman, and so no longer a criminal. I have read some things that claim that made it reflect Defoe's dislike of the lower classes more than the actual way that life turned about. If this is based on Moll King, indeed, Moll King, I don't know that she went to the colonies from Newgate, and I don't know if this would actually reflect her experiences, but certainly the portions of England and Newgate Prison are very, very vivid. So it's convincing enough that that they are based on a real person. Some people claim that this is, if not a feminist work, then at least it provides a window into women and what they did in the 1700s that did not reflect the gender norms of their century. And female empowerment is a word that gets chucked around a lot when it comes to this book. It's not a feminist work per se and as such, but if you argue that feminism is about women having their own autonomy and their own identity and a life or career, in this case, in a way, that is independent of men, I think you could argue very well that Moll Flanders is a feminist style work. What's that index? Bechdel index? I think it succeeds in the Bechdel index in that Moll's, while she's very while she concentrates very heavily on finding men who will support her, it's not her only interest in life by any means. So, why am I reviewing it now? At the moment, I am reading very, very slowly The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. And just something about the way he describes the America in this hypothetical world in which Nazi and Allies, the Axis forces once World War II. Something about the way America has been divided and colonized, and the individuals relate to the world they live in. I think what keeps reminding me of Moll Flanders. It's certainly not the writing. Between the two, I'd have to say that Moll is by far the more engaging. It is actually a delight to read every part of it. The story is good. It's very strange at times, very strange to a modern reader, but the 18th century place setting of it, I think, will attract anyone who likes historical reading. So, yes, Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe, read in 2020, an absolutely stunning piece of literature that is remarkably undated. Thanks for watching. Comment, YouTube likes that. Subscribe, YouTube likes that even more. And what's that other thing you're meant to do? Like. Please like it. Have a great day.